May 1945, Allied forces seized hundreds of V-2 rockets from underground German facilities. Engineers celebrated until the first American test launch exploded on the pad. The rockets were intact, the blueprints were complete, but something critical was missing: the precise fuel mixture that made these missiles fly faster than sound. Without it, America's technological leap forward became a ticking time bomb of failed launches and mounting Soviet threats. April 11th, 1945, 2:34 a.m. Nordhausen, Germany. Temperature 38 degrees. The air reeked of cordite and machine oil. Captain James Hamill of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps stood inside Mittelwerk, a massive underground factory carved into the Harz Mountains, staring at the most sophisticated weapon he'd ever seen: V-2 rockets, dozens of them, some complete, others in various stages of assembly. Hamill's orders were explicit: secure everything before the Soviets arrived. The race wasn't just against time. It was against Stalin's engineers, who were driving westward with the same desperate hunger. The strategic situation was brutally simple. Germany's V-2 program represented a 15-year technological leap. These rockets flew at 3,500 miles per hour, faster than any Allied aircraft could intercept. They struck London from launch sites 200 miles away, giving no warning. Between September 1944 and March 1945, over 3,000 V-2s killed 7,250 people and injured 17,000 more. Conventional air defenses were useless. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them. Fighter planes couldn't catch them. The missiles simply fell from the stratosphere before anyone knew they were coming. But the real threat wasn't the V-2 itself. It was what it represented. Intelligence reports confirmed that Werner von Braun's team at Peenemünde had been developing rockets with 3,000-mile ranges. If Nazi Germany had survived another year, V-2s could have struck New York City from European launch sites. American military planners understood the implications immediately. Whoever controlled this technology would dominate the next war. And the next war, against the Soviet Union, seemed increasingly inevitable. The operational challenge was staggering. The Germans had demolished most of Peenemünde before retreating. Critical documentation was scattered, hidden, or destroyed. Von Braun and his top engineers had surrendered to American forces in Bavaria, but they were negotiating. They wanted immunity, American citizenship, and guarantees they wouldn't be handed to the Soviets. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were less than 100 miles away, moving fast. Every hour mattered. Captain Hamill's team worked in controlled chaos. Engineers from Aberdeen Proving Ground, scientists from Caltech, military logistics officers from the Transportation Corps, all converging on Nordhausen with one mission: evacuate everything: rockets, parts, blueprints, testing equipment, machine tools. Trucks rolled continuously, hauling V-2 components to American-controlled territory. Railway cars were commandeered. Within 2 weeks, Operation Paperclip personnel had relocated 341 freight cars of V-2 materials to Antwerp, then shipped them to New Orleans. The protagonists emerged from this chaos with distinct personalities and motivations. Captain Hamill, 29, from Detroit, Michigan, was a mechanical engineer who'd worked at Ford before the war. He understood assembly lines, logistics, industrial production. His job was securing hardware. Major Robert Staver, 31, from Illinois, was the technical intelligence officer responsible for identifying which German scientists were worth recruiting. Dr. Richard Porter, 34, from General Electric's Research Division, was the civilian expert tasked with understanding how these rockets actually worked. All three men shared one characteristic: they refused to accept that American engineering couldn't match or surpass German innovation. But they faced immediate skepticism. Colonel Holger Toftoy, chief of U.S. Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence, initially dismissed the V-2 as an expensive way to deliver 1 ton of explosives. Senior Air Force generals argued that long-range bombers made missiles obsolete. Budget-conscious politicians questioned spending millions on captured German weapons when the war was ending. The resistance wasn't just institutional, it was philosophical. American military doctrine emphasized manned aircraft, not unmanned rockets. The decision point came on May 22, 1945. Soviet forces occupied Nordhausen. They found the factory stripped bare. American forces had evacuated virtually everything of value in less than 6 weeks. But the victory was incomplete. The V-2s were in American hands, yes. The rockets were physically intact. The blueprints showed every weld, every valve, every component. What they didn't show, what no document captured, was the fuel. German engineers used a liquid propellant system, ethanol mixed with water as fuel, liquid oxygen as oxidizer. But the ratios mattered enormously. Too much water, the rocket lost thrust. Too little, the combustion chamber overheated and exploded. The Germans had spent years perfecting the mixture through trial and error. They documented results, but not the precise formulation. That knowledge resided in the minds of engineers like von Braun, Dr. Walter Thiel, killed in an RAF raid, and dozens of technicians now scattered across occupied Germany. June 1945. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The first V-2 rockets arrived by train. Engineers assembled them carefully, following German blueprints exactly. They filled the tanks with ethanol and water, guessing at the ratio. They loaded liquid oxygen. They ran through pre-flight checks. Everything looked correct. On paper, it was perfect. The first launch was scheduled for April 1946. Nobody knew it would take 70 attempts before they got it right. The race to understand the V-2 wasn't over. It was just beginning. January 10, 1946, 11:47 a.m. White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. Temperature 52 degrees, clear skies, perfect launch conditions. Dr. Richard Porter stood in the blockhouse, a reinforced concrete bunker 1,000 feet from Launch Complex 33, watching technicians perform final checks on V-2 serial number 1. The rocket stood 46 feet tall, gleaming white in the desert sun. 2 years of preparation had led to this moment. American engineers had studied every blueprint, interviewed dozens of German scientists, practiced assembly procedures until they could rebuild a V-2 blindfolded. The countdown reached 0. The rocket ignited and immediately exploded in a fireball that sent debris raining across the proving ground for 3 minutes. The failure wasn't an anomaly. It was the beginning of a pattern that would haunt White Sands for the next 18 months. V-2 serial number 2 lifted off successfully, then veered wildly off course and crashed after 23 seconds. Number 3 exploded during fueling. Number 4 achieved altitude but broke apart at 20,000 feet. Number 5 through 8 failed in various catastrophic ways. Combustion chamber ruptures, turbopump failures, guidance system malfunctions, structural failures. The rockets were identical to those the Germans had launched successfully. The procedures followed German protocols precisely. But something fundamental was wrong. The operational environment was brutally demanding. White Sands was hastily constructed. Barracks housing 500 personnel, workshops, blockhouses, launch complexes, all built in less than a year on 3,200 square miles of desert scrubland. The climate was harsh. Summer temperatures exceeded 110 degrees N. Winter nights dropped below freezing, sandstorms damaged equipment, rattlesnakes infested work areas. The infrastructure was primitive compared to Peenemunde's sophisticated facilities. German engineers had worked in heated workshops with precision tools. American technicians assembled rockets in open-air facilities using improvised equipment. The technical challenges were overwhelming. Liquid oxygen boiled at 297 degrees, requiring constant refrigeration. Ethanol had to be precisely 75% alcohol, 25% water. But nobody knew if that ratio was correct. German documentation specified 75-25 mixture, but field testing suggested variations. Some launches used 72-28, others 78-22. The combustion chamber operated at 14,900 degrees stars, hotter than most industrial furnaces. Turbopumps spun at 4,000 RPM, pumping propellants at pressures exceeding 200 psi. Every variable affected performance. Change the fuel mixture by 2%. Lose 300 MPH velocity. Adjust the oxygen flow rate. Risk combustion instability. The tolerances were microscopic. Environmental factors compounded problems. Peenemünde was at sea level. White Sands sat at 4,000-foot elevation. Atmospheric pressure differed by 15%, affecting combustion efficiency. German rockets launched in European weather, humidity, moderate temperatures. New Mexico was arid, extreme, unpredictable. Launch procedures developed in Germany didn't translate perfectly. Valves that worked reliably in Hamburg froze in New Mexico winters. Seals that held pressure at Peenemünde failed in desert heat. Everything needed adjustment, but adjusting required understanding why the Germans had designed it that way, and that knowledge was fragmentary. The human element was equally challenging. Operation Paperclip had brought 127 German scientists and engineers to the United States, including von Braun and his core team. They were technically brilliant, but politically complicated. Some were genuine anti-Nazis who'd resisted the regime. Others were opportunists who'd worked willingly for Hitler. Many had witnessed atrocities at Mittelwerk, where slave laborers from concentration camps built V-2s under horrific conditions. American engineers struggled to reconcile moral revulsion with operational necessity. They needed these men's expertise, but working alongside them was psychologically difficult. Dr. Porter personified this tension. His team included American civilians from General Electric, RCA, and Douglas Aircraft, men who'd spent the war developing radar, proximity fuses, and bomber aircraft. They were proud of American engineering and skeptical of German superiority claims. Yet every test failure proved the Germans had mastered something Americans didn't understand. The frustration was palpable. Engineers worked 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week, analyzing failure data. They tested fuel mixtures systematically, 70-30, 72-28, 75-25, 78-22. They adjusted ignition timing in 0.1-second increments. They recalibrated turbopumps, replaced valves, modified combustion chambers. Colonel Harold Turner, the military commander at White Sands, faced mounting pressure from Washington. Each launch cost approximately $50,000, equivalent to $750,000 in modern terms. After 12 failures, Congress began questioning the program. Senators demanded accountability. Why were American engineers failing to operate weapons that German technicians had launched routinely? The answer was humiliating, because rocketry wasn't just engineering. It was craft knowledge developed through thousands of hours of hands-on experience. The Germans had that experience. Americans didn't. All the blueprints in the world couldn't replace practical wisdom. The breakthrough began not with American innovation, but with German candor. Ernst Steinhoff, one of von Braun's top engineers, finally explained the problem during a meeting in March 1946. The fuel mixture wasn't constant. It varied by altitude, temperature, and launch angle. German crews adjusted it before every launch based on weather conditions and mission profile. They didn't document these adjustments because they were intuitive, developed through years of operational experience. American teams were following written procedures rigidly, not adapting to conditions. They were treating rocket science like factory production when it was actually more like cooking, requiring judgment, adjustment, feel. This revelation transformed the program. American engineers stopped trying to perfectly replicate German methods and started developing their own operational expertise. They launched smaller test rockets to understand propellant behavior at White Sands conditions. They created detailed checklists documenting every adjustment. They trained crews through repetition, building institutional knowledge. By June 1946, success rates improved dramatically. V-2 serial number 13 flew perfectly. Number 14 through 20 achieved their mission parameters. The Americans weren't just copying German rockets anymore, they were mastering them. But the psychological cost was severe. Engineers suffered exhaustion-related health problems. Marriages collapsed under the strain of long separations. Several personnel requested transfers after witnessing repeated catastrophic failures. The pressure of working alongside former enemy engineers created lasting tension. Some Germans integrated well, becoming respected colleagues. Others remained isolated, viewed with suspicion and resentment. The collaboration worked operationally, but it was never comfortable morally. September 15, 1946, Moscow, 9:23 p.m. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin sat in his Kremlin office reviewing intelligence reports from the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. The documents described American rocket launches at White Sands. The analysis was disturbing. American success rates were improving rapidly. V-2 flights were achieving longer ranges than German wartime launches. The reports included photographs of modified American rockets with enhanced guidance systems. Stalin's engineers had assured him that American technology lagged behind Soviet capabilities. These reports contradicted that assessment completely. Soviet forces had captured Peenemünde in May 1945, weeks after American forces stripped Nordhausen. They found abandoned facilities, burned documents, and shattered equipment. Operation Osoaviakim, launched in October 1946, forcibly relocated over 2,000 German scientists and their families to the Soviet Union. The Soviets had German expertise, arguably more German personnel than the Americans. They had German facilities. They'd reconstructed entire laboratories in Russia. Yet their rocket program was progressing slower than expected. Test launches at Kapustin Yar were plagued by failures. Soviet-built copies of V-2s performed inconsistently. Something wasn't working. The doctrinal conflict was fundamental. Soviet military philosophy emphasized centralized control, rigid hierarchy, standardized procedures. Their approach to rocket development reflected this. Detailed 5-year plans, committee oversight, bureaucratic approval for every modification. Engineers followed protocols exactly, with minimal room for improvisation. This worked well for conventional weapons, but proved catastrophic for rocketry. Rockets required constant adjustment, rapid iteration, real-time problem-solving. Soviet procedures strangled innovation. Every failure triggered investigations, blame assignments, purges. Engineers became conservative, risk-averse, terrified of deviating from approved methods. American operations, by contrast, had evolved toward pragmatic flexibility. White Sands crews were authorized to make field adjustments without awaiting Washington approval. If a fuel mixture needed modification, engineers changed it and documented results. If a valve design proved faulty, machinists fabricated replacements immediately. The American approach wasn't planned. It emerged from necessity after early failures. But it created a culture of continuous improvement that Soviet rigidity couldn't match. Colonel General Vasily Voznyuk, chief of the Soviet rocket program, recognized this disparity but couldn't overcome it. He was a brilliant artillery officer, personally brave, technically competent. But he operated within Stalin's system, where failure meant imprisonment or execution. Voznyuk's engineers were terrified to report problems honestly. They falsified test data, concealed failures, exaggerated successes. Voznyuk knew the data was corrupted, but couldn't acknowledge it without implicating himself. The system rewarded deception and punished truth. German scientists working in Russia recognized the dysfunction immediately. Helmut Gröttrup, a senior guidance systems engineer from Peenemünde, kept private journals describing the chaos: resources diverted by bureaucratic infighting, equipment stolen by corrupt officials, qualified personnel arrested on trumped-up espionage charges, promising projects cancelled abruptly when political winds shifted. Gröttrup cooperated superficially while secretly hoping to return to Germany. He provided enough information to satisfy Soviet authorities, but withheld critical insights. Many German engineers did the same. They weren't sabotaging deliberately, they simply weren't giving their full effort to a system that treated them as prisoners. The first confrontation came in January 1947. American engineers at White Sands achieved a record V-2 flight. 114 miles altitude, 3,600 MPH maximum velocity, perfect trajectory. The performance exceeded anything Germans had accomplished during the war. Photographs appeared in American newspapers and technical journals. Soviet intelligence analysts studied the images obsessively. The rockets looked identical to Soviet versions, but American performance was consistently superior. How? GRU operatives were dispatched to infiltrate White Sands, recruit informants, steal documentation. They learned fragments. American crews were using modified fuel mixtures, enhanced turbopumps, improved guidance systems, but the modifications were iterative, small adjustments refined through hundreds of tests. There was no single secret to steal. The American advantage was systemic: better testing procedures, more operational experience, freedom to experiment. Soviet agents could photograph blueprints, but they couldn't replicate organizational culture. Soviet leadership reacted with characteristic paranoia. Wozniak was accused of incompetence. Several engineers were arrested for wrecking, deliberately sabotaging the program. German scientists faced intensified surveillance. Stalin demanded immediate improvement, threatening consequences if American capabilities continued outpacing Soviet progress. The pressure produced the opposite of its intended effect. Terrified engineers became even more conservative, avoiding any innovation that might fail and implicate them. Meanwhile, American confidence soared. By mid-1947, White Sands launches were routine. Engineers weren't just operating V-2s, they were modifying them extensively. They added instrumentation packages to study atmospheric conditions. They tested new guidance systems. They experimented with propellant combinations beyond German formulas. The Americans had transformed from students copying German designs into innovators pushing technology forward. The psychological shift was profound. American engineers stopped viewing Germans as superior and started seeing them as colleagues, valuable, yes, but not irreplaceable. The perplexity of Soviet commanders deepened when American rockets began carrying scientific payloads to unprecedented altitudes. Project Bumper launched a WASI Corporal rocket atop a V-2, achieving 244 miles altitude in February 1949, the highest altitude ever reached by a man-made object. Soviet rockets couldn't match that performance. The American lead was widening, not closing. Soviet intelligence couldn't explain it. They had equivalent technology, more personnel, greater industrial capacity. Yet they were falling behind. The fundamental miscalculation was philosophical. Soviet planners assumed technology was objective, that given identical blueprints and materials, any competent engineer would produce identical results. They didn't account for organizational culture, iterative learning, or psychological factors like creativity and risk tolerance. American success wasn't from superior intelligence or resources. It came from a system that encouraged experimentation, tolerated failure, and empowered engineers to make decisions without bureaucratic approval. Soviet rigidity prevented them from adopting similar practices without dismantling the entire state apparatus. By 1949, American rocket technology had diverged significantly from German origins. The Corporal missile, developed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, used entirely American-designed propulsion systems. The Nike anti-aircraft missile program employed solid fuel propellants, eliminating the complexity of liquid fuels entirely. American engineers weren't copying Germans anymore. They were innovating independently. The V-2 had been a beginning, not an end. It taught Americans the fundamentals of rocketry, but they'd built upon that foundation with characteristic pragmatism and ambition. July 16, 1969, 9:32 a.m., Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Saturn V rocket AS-506 stood on Launch Complex 39A, fueled and ready. Inside the command module, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins awaited ignition. The rocket's first stage burned RP-1 kerosene and liquid oxygen, not the ethanol-water mixture of the V-2, but a direct descendant of technologies pioneered at White Sands 2 decades earlier. The propulsion systems, guidance computers, fuel management protocols all traced their lineage to those brutal months in 1946 when American engineers had learned rocketry through failure and persistence. The countdown reached 0. The Saturn V lifted off flawlessly, beginning humanity's first journey to another world. The connection between V-2 struggles and Apollo success was direct and profound. Every principle mastered at White Sands, propellant chemistry, combustion stability, turbopump design, structural dynamics, became foundational knowledge for NASA's moon program. The engineers who'd assembled those first captured V-2s in New Mexico went on to lead America's space efforts. Wernher von Braun, the German scientist who designed the V-2, became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, overseeing Saturn V development. The institutional knowledge created through painful trial and error at White Sands became America's strategic advantage in the space race. The immediate post-war impact was military, not scientific. By 1950, the United States possessed operational rocket capabilities that exceeded anything achieved during World War II. The Corporal missile provided battlefield tactical support with 75-mile range and precision guidance. The Redstone missile, developed at Huntsville, Alabama under von Braun's direction, achieved 200-mile range with nuclear warhead capability. These weapons weren't just improved V-2s, they represented entirely new engineering approaches developed through American operational experience. The Soviet Union possessed equivalent technology, but American systems were more reliable, more accurate, and more readily deployable. The strategic implications transformed Cold War dynamics. American rockets could deliver atomic weapons across intercontinental distances by the mid-1950s. Soviet capabilities lagged initially, though they caught up dramatically with Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight in 1961. The competition spurred both nations to invest massively in rocket technology, aerospace engineering, and scientific education. The space race was fundamentally a missile race. Every rocket that carried satellites or astronauts could potentially carry nuclear warheads. The technologies were inseparable, but the civilian applications proved equally revolutionary. The scientific instruments carried by V-2s at White Sands during 1946-1952 produced unprecedented data about Earth's upper atmosphere. They photographed Earth's curvature from 100 miles altitude, images that transformed meteorology, communications, and geopolitics. They measured cosmic radiation, solar ultraviolet emissions, atmospheric composition at extreme altitudes. These experiments laid groundwork for weather satellites, GPS systems, telecommunications satellites, and Earth observation programs that now underpin modern civilization. The V-2, designed as a weapon of terror, became an instrument of scientific discovery. The human stories behind this transformation were complex and morally ambiguous. Wernher von Braun became an American hero, appearing on television, consulting with Disney on space exploration, celebrated as the visionary architect of the moon landing. His wartime role remained controversial. He'd been an SS officer, he'd visited Mittelwerk, where slave laborers died building V-2s, he'd prioritized weapons development over ethical concerns. American authorities granted him immunity partly because his expertise was considered essential, partly because the Cold War demanded pragmatic alliances regardless of past actions. The moral calculus was utilitarian. Von Braun's knowledge would save American lives and advance American interests. Therefore, his past was subordinated to present necessity. The American engineers who'd struggled at White Sands pursued diverse paths. Dr. Richard Porter became a senior executive at General Electric, applying aerospace knowledge to commercial ventures. Colonel Harold Turner retired from the Army and worked as a defense consultant, advising on missile systems throughout the Cold War. Captain James Hamill returned to Detroit, working at Ford's Aerospace Division on guidance systems for military aircraft. Some received recognition, medals, promotions, prestigious positions. Others worked anonymously, their contributions known only to colleagues and family. All carried forward the lessons learned in that harsh New Mexico desert, that innovation requires tolerance for failure, that expertise comes through repetition, that determination matters as much as intelligence. The German scientists faced more complicated legacies. Many remained in the United States permanently, becoming naturalized citizens, raising American families, contributing to universities and research institutions. They were generally respected professionally, but never fully escaped their wartime pasts. Ernst Steinhoff, who'd explained fuel mixture adjustments in 1946, worked at NASA until retirement, then taught aerospace engineering at Arizona State University. Helmut Grötrup, who'd worked reluctantly for the Soviets, eventually returned to Germany and worked in private industry. Some Germans struggled psychologically, haunted by memories of what they'd witnessed or enabled. Others compartmentalized, focusing on present achievements while rarely discussing the past. The long-term impact on American national identity was subtle but significant. The space program became a symbol of American exceptionalism, proof that American ingenuity, determination, and resources could accomplish anything. The narrative emphasized American triumphs while minimizing German contributions. School textbooks celebrated NASA's achievements without dwelling on Operation Paperclip or V-2 origins. The Apollo program was presented as purely American accomplishment, which was partially true. By 1969, American engineers had far surpassed German starting points. But the foundation was German technology, refined through American operational experience and organizational culture. The most profound legacy was institutional. NASA inherited the culture created at White Sands: pragmatic problem-solving, tolerance for calculated risks, empowerment of engineers to make field decisions, continuous iteration toward improvement. These principles weren't written in mission statements. They were embedded in organizational practices developed through years of rocket testing. When Apollo 13 suffered a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion in 1970, NASA engineers improvised solutions in real time using materials aboard the spacecraft. That capacity for rapid improvisation under pressure traced directly back to White Sands crews, who'd learned to adjust fuel mixtures and modify procedures without waiting for bureaucratic approval. The can-do ethos wasn't rhetoric, it was capability developed through experience. By 1972, when the final Apollo mission returned from the moon, America's rocket expertise had transcended its German origins completely. The space shuttle, conceived in the 1970s and operational by 1981, bore no resemblance to V-2 technology. It used solid fuel boosters, hydrogen-oxygen propulsion, computer-controlled guidance systems, all developed through decades of American innovation building upon that initial foundation. The struggles of 1946 were largely forgotten, remembered only by aging engineers and aerospace historians. But the capabilities those struggles created remained central to American technological dominance. The story concluded with a quiet moment of reflection. On July 20, 1994, the 25th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, a reunion was held at White Sands. A dozen elderly engineers gathered at Launch Complex 33, now a historical site preserved as a monument. They walked through the blockhouse where they'd watched those early V-2 failures, They stood on the launch pad, where rockets had exploded, succeeded, taught them everything they needed to know. These men had witnessed the birth of the space age. They'd learned rocketry the hard way, through failure, persistence, and refusal to accept that American engineering was inferior to anyone's. They'd taken captured German weapons and transformed them into instruments of exploration. They'd proven that innovation isn't just about intelligence or resources, it's about culture, determination, and the freedom to fail, learn, and try again. That was the real secret behind the fuel mixture. Not the chemistry, but the human spirit that refused to give up until they'd mastered it.